Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Flower of Ruin, written by Dark Prince 010. The concealed research world. It was a well-known secret. A small planet orbiting a larger, more rocky, and inhospitable world near the galactic core. It had become a relatively early colony of Earth shortly before the start of the War of the Three Spheres, and some decades prior to humanity's apparent defeat in said war. They were outmanned and cowed by both the Irek and the Shishalians, and had withdrawn to their innermost rings of holding. There, the other two empires could effectively ignore them for the remainder of the campaign. But, thanks to proximate astrological distance, the Irek were able to reach the weapon satellite first and build a substantial bulkhead defense. When the Shishilians arrived dozens of cycles later, the battle, though lengthy, was decisive, and the Irek solidified their hold over the research station. There were abandoned human resource facilities dotted all over the planet's surface, all within the habitable climate region. The fortunate size and distance of the planet from the cool blue star at the system center meant that, except for some small polar regions to the north and south, the majority of the planet was temperate and livable, albeit not necessarily resource-rich. The climate was temperate and marshy, with some limited carbon-based plant life forms native to the planetoid's surface. These plants had been mostly supplanted or replaced, of course, by the subject of human research. One cultivated in vast fields with water held back by earthen embankments and careful canal placement for irrigation. In case of poison or infestative spread, although all signs showed that they were nearly unmodified physically from the same species that once grew at Earth. There were some changes, however, and apparently there had been a very strong drive by human researchers to instead inject some sort of psychic presence or aura into these plants. At all stages in their life cycle, they emanated a low subconscious field that was perceptible to both the Irek and the Shishilian biologies. Well, the prudent thing would have been to leave it entirely alone or burn the fields and the world to prevent the research from escaping the planetoid. Instead, the Irek sought to investigate to see how this biological superweapon could be leveraged to provide them an advantage in the war. So the first test subjects were sent down, allowed to mingle, survive in the comfortable dwellings the humans had left behind, and generally stay for observation by scientists in orbiting craft far above, out of range from the psychic field. But the test subjects on the surface showed no signs of ill effects. They were certainly interested in the plants, especially when they began to bloom and flower, covering many swaths of the planetoid with brilliant pastel hues from the fragrant and colorful petals on stout green stalks. The one curiosity was that the test subjects were quite adamant that the flowers were of high value, something indeed that they rightly supposed would be well valued in other areas of the Empire as well. Initial testing showed that they grew well in wet, temperate conditions, meaning they could be raised on a wide swath of Irek worlds. They could even provide a trade good that the Shishilians and their love for flora would value, they said, something that would provide the Empire a non-hostile bargaining chip at the diplomatic table, should their possibility become more preferable than warfare or espionage. The scientists were curious about this focus, but soon realized that effectively the psychic presence was, as far as they could tell, enhancing the interest in and attractiveness of the bulb and flower. Soon the conclusion was reached that this was likely a case where the translations that had indicated a biological super weapon were likely mistranslated. This appeared to be more of an economic research hub, one intended to create a lucrative product that effectively advertised itself. Certainly not overwhelming as the prize, given the moderate bloodshed that had led to the IS-6 control of this planetoid, but not so invaluable that it would be considered a complete waste. Indeed, the blooms and bulbs soon became common gifts in Irek high society, and from there, the rest of their rigid castes began to adopt the flowers as status symbols and gifts, enjoying the fragrant scents and ease of planting. The genome for the plants was also curiously locked, and it appeared that deliberate encoding had taken place so as to make it impossible to reverse engineer or further modify the species. While some were concerned about the implications that such a safeguard would entail, most chalked it up to further evidence of economic motives, a means of safeguarding intellectual property against competition, and so the blooms continued to spread. But there was another element of the psychic profile that was not found until it was too late. For there was also an implicit suggestion and propensity for those influenced by the effects of the blooms to seek to use the flowers and their bulbs as tools to materially increase their own personal wealth. This was something that had previously been discouraged, if not completely outlawed, in Iric society. But now, with the flowers, communalism quickly fell by the wayside as the bulbs and flowers were traded more and more, effectively becoming a substitute currency in lieu of the official credits by the Iric nation. The flowers could be cultivated and grown with just a few years between planting and harvest. The yield of additional bulbs that could be grown from a single flower meant that it was often better investment than a paltry interest rate offered by financial institutions of Iric. As a result, the entirety of Iric culture began to revolve around these little innocuous flowers, nearly everywhere selling for soon dozens, if not hundreds more credits than an Iric soldier would earn in an entire solar cycle. As the frenzy grew, there were speculators who would trade and purchase mere agreements for acquiring the flowers for future harvests, hoping to insulate themselves from the rapid inflation that threatened to spiral ever further out of control. Soon, almost all aspects of the Iric economy were touched by the flower, and they began to realize that the over-reliance on this was a critical weak point. The government tried in vain to impose taxes and tariffs on the trades of the bulbs, attempting to forestall an economic catastrophe. But it was too little, too late. It was scarcely 20 years after the Iric had begun growing and propagating the bulb flowers, and already the Sicilians had expressed interest in the flowers as well, setting up trade routes and smuggling the bulbs in despite their embargoes, making them more popular than ever. Then the third and final aspect, the human trap, clicked into place, for the bulbs had a carefully cultivated, delayed trigger, a self-destructive genetic time bomb. Crops began to wither in the field and die before the blooming or producing salvageable bulbs. The human researchers had been careful here to not destroy all of the crop, only most of it, and due to this rather precipitous blight of the flower, losses rose to 9 out of 10 planted, no more, no less. The effect it had on the already teetering Iric economy was catastrophic, and soon entire systems were put bankrupt, or sold in an attempt to pay debts and reassess fines. A single bulb could command the price of a starship, and a field could pay for the value of the planet it was planted on. The Iric Empire was in shambles, its war machine struggling to simply pay for itself and its existing holdings, let alone find the funds to continue aggressive expansion outwards. The Sicilians had fared slightly better, but were still hit by the aftershocks of this economic Armageddon, and for a time, the war seemed to pause. The crops and flowers continued to falter, but a supply of bulbs seemed to be readily tradable, albeit more scarce than before. However, the economics and botanists who were curious about this newfound surge in bulbs in trade found that it slightly exceeded what they projected the empire was actually able to produce. They began tracing suppliers and merchants, painstakingly backtracking the shipments, and found that nearly half the bulbs still being sold on the Iric markets were not of Iric origin at all. They came from other, smaller traders. The trader ships were neither Iric or Sicilian. They did not appear to be human, but no captains could confirm having ever seen a true identity of the species they traded with. Their greed for flowers blinded them to the manipulation at play. The worst suspicions of the Iric leaders were confirmed when humanity re-emerged into the war, armed with a wide host of Iric ships and weaponry, supplies from Iric worlds, and the occasional Sicilian craft from planets that had been caught in the maelstrom of the inflationary bubble's rapture. With this fleet, humanity single-handedly had catapulted itself from a forgotten loser in a conflict to being able to stand toe-to-toe against either empire's full fleet, and quite possibly both at once. The Iaric signaled their withdrawal despite misgivings and their instinctive pride, citing internal concerns and having to right their own ship and reset the damage that had been done to it at all levels. This healing would take years, as the lingering effects of the psychic poisoning the flower head had imparted persisted long after the flower itself had been eradicated and forbidden from legal trading. The War of the Three Spheres ended, humanity putting a dark horse victory, and in the textbooks that followed, a pair of lessons was imparted in every generation of Iaric and Sicilian scholars that followed. Some of the words were foreign to the aliens, unique terms from the English tongue, but lessons they had learned far too late, and lessons they had vowed to ensure their people, their civilization, never forgot. Beware decoupling from intrinsic value, and beware humans bearing tulips. End of story.
I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.